The morning mist clung to Tokyo Bay like a shroud of destiny, as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the deck of the battleship Nagato, watching the final preparations for what would become the most audacious naval operation in history. It was November 26, 1941, and the die had been cast. 6 aircraft carriers, their flight decks bristling with over 400 warplanes, prepared to steam toward a date with infamy. The roots of this moment stretched back decades, woven through a tapestry of misunderstanding, racial prejudice, and competing imperial ambitions. Japan's meteoric rise from feudal isolation to industrial powerhouse had been nothing short of miraculous, yet it had come at a cost that few in the West truly comprehended. The island nation, resource-poor and overcrowded, had looked toward the vast expanses of China and Southeast Asia, not with the casual greed of Western colonizers, but with the desperate hunger of a nation facing starvation. Emperor Hirohito, though, constitutionally limited in power, had watched with growing concern as his military leaders pushed deeper into China following the Marco Polo Bridge incident of 1937. What had begun as a localized skirmish had mushroomed into a full-scale war that consumed men and materials at an alarming rate. The Japanese army, drunk on early victories and convinced of their racial superiority, had committed atrocities in Nanking that shocked even hardened diplomats. The rape of Nanking, as it would become known, had turned international opinion decisively against Japan. Reference: contemporary accounts from the New York Times archives from December 1937 documented the international outrage following reports of the Nanking massacre. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, confined to his wheelchair but possessing one of the sharpest political minds of his generation, had watched Japan's expansion with growing alarm. The United States, still reeling from the Great Depression and deeply committed to isolationism, nevertheless could not ignore the threat to American interests in the Pacific. The Philippines, America's colonial jewel, lay directly in the path of Japanese expansion. More immediately concerning were the reports of Japanese submarines prowling American waters and the growing alliance between Tokyo, Berlin, and Rome. The Tripartite Pact, signed on September 27, 1940, had formalized what American intelligence had long suspected. Japan was now formally allied with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Roosevelt, who had been maneuvering to support Britain against Hitler while maintaining official neutrality, now faced the prospect of a two-ocean war. The president's advisors, led by Secretary of State Cordell Hull, had begun implementing a series of economic sanctions designed to pressure Japan into abandoning its aggressive expansion. The first blow had come in the form of the Export Control Act, which restricted the sale of aviation fuel and scrap metal to Japan. For a nation entirely dependent on imports for its war machine, this was tantamount to economic warfare. Japanese Prime Minister Prince Fumimaro Konoe, a moderate who had genuinely sought to avoid war with America, found himself increasingly isolated as military hardliners gained influence in the imperial cabinet. General Hideki Tojo, the razor-sharp army minister who would soon replace Konoe as prime minister, had no illusions about Japan's position. The nation had perhaps 18 months of oil reserves remaining. Without access to the rich petroleum fields of the Dutch East Indies, Japan's war machine would grind to a halt, leaving the nation vulnerable to Chinese counterattack and Western retaliation. The choice, as Tojo saw it, was simple: surrender Japan's dreams of Asian hegemony or fight for them before it was too late. Secretary of State Cordell Hull adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles as he reviewed the latest intelligence reports from Japan in his State Department office. The date was July 25, 1941, and the news was grim. Japanese forces had occupied French Indochina, positioning themselves dangerously close to the vital sea lanes that connected the Western Pacific to the Indian Ocean. President Roosevelt's response had been swift and devastating: a complete freeze on all Japanese assets in the United States. The economic noose around Japan's neck had tightened to a stranglehold. Not only were Japanese funds in American banks frozen, but the crucial flow of oil from American suppliers had ceased entirely. Britain and the Dutch government in exile had quickly followed suit, cutting off Japan's access to petroleum from their colonies. For a nation that imported 90% of its oil, this was an existential threat that could not be ignored. Prime Minister Konoe, increasingly desperate, had proposed a face-to-face meeting with President Roosevelt. The Japanese leader, educated at Kyoto Imperial University and possessing a deep appreciation for Western culture, genuinely believed that personal diplomacy might succeed where formal negotiations had failed. He envisioned meeting Roosevelt in Hawaii or Alaska, away from the pressures of their respective capitals, where they might find common ground. Roosevelt, however, remained skeptical. Intelligence reports suggested that even as Konoe spoke of peace, Japanese military preparations continued unabated. The president's military advisors, led by Army Chief of Staff General George Catlett Marshall and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Rainsford Stark, warned that Japan might be buying time while positioning forces for a surprise attack. The memory of the Russo-Japanese War, which had begun with Japan's devastating sneak attack on Port Arthur in 1904, weighed heavily on American strategic thinking. The crucial moment came on October 16, 1941, when General Tojo replaced the moderate Konoe as prime minister. Tojo, known for his rigid discipline and uncompromising nature, had earned the nickname the Razor for his sharp mind and cutting personality. Unlike his predecessor, Tojo harbored no illusions about the possibility of peaceful resolution with the United States. He had studied at the Japanese Army War College and served as a military attaché in Europe, giving him intimate knowledge of modern warfare tactics. Reference: Time magazine's coverage from October 1941 characterized Tojo's appointment as marking the end of moderate voices in Japanese leadership. Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura, Japan's representative in Washington, found himself in an increasingly impossible position. A former naval officer who had lost an eye during the Russo-Japanese War, Nomura genuinely sought to prevent conflict between his homeland and his host country, where he had developed genuine friendships. He had been joined in November by Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu, a career diplomat who had served as ambassador to Germany and had actually signed the Tripartite Pact on Japan's behalf. The two Japanese diplomats worked tirelessly to find a formula that might satisfy both nations. Their final proposal, delivered to Secretary Hull on November 20th, offered to withdraw Japanese forces from southern Indochina in exchange for the restoration of normal trade relations and American neutrality in the China conflict. Hull, however, found the proposal inadequate. Japan would retain its forces in northern Indochina and continue its war in China, positions that the Secretary of State found unacceptable. Hull's counter-proposal, delivered on November 26th, amounted to Japan's complete surrender of its imperial ambitions. The Hull Note, as it became known, demanded Japan's withdrawal from both China and Indochina, recognition of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government in China, and withdrawal from the Tripartite Pact. For Japanese leaders, who had spent 4 years and countless lives establishing their position in China, these demands were tantamount to national humiliation. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, had long opposed war with the United States. Having studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, he understood American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues. "I can run wild for 6 months or a year," he had warned his superiors, "but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." Nevertheless, if war was inevitable, Yamamoto believed Japan's only hope lay in a devastating first strike that might force America to negotiate rather than fight a prolonged conflict. The War Council, convened in the Imperial Palace on December 1, 1941, carried the weight of a nation's destiny. Emperor Hirohito, slight in stature but bearing the accumulated authority of over 2,000 years of imperial tradition, sat in silence as his military leaders presented their final arguments. The decision before them would determine whether Japan would risk everything in a desperate gamble for empire, or accept what they viewed as national humiliation and slow strangulation. General Tojo, now firmly in control as prime minister, presented the military's position with characteristic bluntness. Japan's oil reserves would last perhaps 4 more months. Every day of delay weakened the nation's position while strengthening that of its enemies. American military aid to China continued unabated, prolonging a conflict that was bleeding Japan white. Meanwhile, the American naval buildup in the Pacific proceeded at an alarming pace, with new battleships and aircraft carriers joining the fleet monthly. The intelligence reports painted an equally grim picture. Colonel Minoru Genda, the brilliant, young staff officer who had helped plan the Pearl Harbor attack, reported that American forces in Hawaii were at their most vulnerable. The Pacific Fleet, concentrated at Pearl Harbor for ease of maintenance and training, presented a target of unprecedented value. 6 months hence, when American preparations were complete, such an attack would be impossible. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, one of the few remaining moderates in the cabinet, made a final plea for continued negotiations. A career diplomat who had served in Germany, America, and the Soviet Union, Togo understood the catastrophic implications of war with the United States. He pointed to Japan's experience in China, where 4 years of fighting had produced stalemate. Despite initial promises of quick victory, how could Japan hope to defeat an enemy with 10 times its industrial capacity? Admiral Yamamoto's plan, however, offered a tantalizing possibility. By destroying the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Japan could gain the breathing space necessary to consolidate its conquests in Southeast Asia. The oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, and the strategic bases of the Philippines could be secured before America could mount an effective counterattack. Faced with a fait accompli and the prospect of a costly Pacific War, American public opinion might force Roosevelt to negotiate a settlement recognizing Japan's new empire. Reference: declassified Japanese government documents, published in the ECE 1970s by the Japanese Defense Agency, revealed the detailed discussions of this crucial war council. The emperor's decision, communicated through the subtle protocols of court etiquette, sealed Japan's fate. On December 2nd, the coded message, "Climb Mount Niitaka," flashed across the Pacific to Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's strike force, already steaming eastward through the gray waters of the North Pacific. The die was cast. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, selected to lead the first wave of attackers, spent the remaining days in intensive preparation. A veteran pilot with over 3,000 flight hours, Fuchida understood the magnitude of his mission. Success would depend on achieving complete surprise, coordinating attacks across multiple targets, and maintaining radio silence during the approach. The slightest mistake could turn triumph into disaster. The Japanese task force, designated Kido Butai, represented the cream of the Imperial Navy. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, carried 414 aircraft. Supporting them were 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. Never before had such a force been assembled for a single operation. As the ships pushed eastward through increasingly rough seas, maintaining strict radio silence and avoiding all commercial shipping lanes, the weight of secrecy pressed upon every sailor. They knew their destination, but not their exact mission. Rumors circulated through the crews. They were bound for training exercises, for an attack on Soviet Vladivostok, for operations in Southeast Asia. Only the senior officers knew the truth. Admiral Nagumo, the task force commander, remained deeply skeptical of the operation. A veteran of traditional surface warfare, he questioned the wisdom of risking Japan's most valuable assets on such a desperate gamble. Unlike Yamamoto, Nagumo had little understanding of aviation warfare and even less confidence in its effectiveness. Against heavily defended targets, his concerns would prove prophetic, though not in ways he anticipated. The pre-dawn darkness of December 7, 1941, enveloped the Hawaiian Islands like a velvet shroud, broken only by the distant gleam of Pearl Harbor's navigation lights. Aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, 300 miles north of Oahu, Lieutenant Commander Fuchida completed his final preparations as the ship's loudspeakers crackled to life with Admiral Nagumo's terse announcement. The rise and fall of the empire depends upon today's battle. Every man will do his duty. The flight deck erupted in controlled chaos as deck crews prepared the first wave of attackers. 183 aircraft, 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 fighters would constitute the largest naval airstrike in history. mechanics made final adjustments to engines that had been lovingly maintained during the 2-week voyage. Ordnance crews armed the specially modified 16-inch armor-piercing shells that would serve as bombs against the American battleships. Fuchida climbed into his Nakajima Kate bomber as the eastern sky began to show the first faint traces of dawn. At 6 o'clock precisely, his aircraft roared down Akagi's flight deck and lifted into the morning air, followed in rapid succession by the remaining first-wave attackers. Below them, the 6 carriers of the task force turned into the wind, their flight decks alive with activity as the second wave prepared for launch. The flight to Oahu took 90 minutes, with Fuchida navigating by radio signals from Honolulu's commercial stations. The weather was perfect. Scattered clouds at 3,000 feet with unlimited visibility below. As the Hawaiian coastline materialized ahead, Fuchida could scarcely believe what he saw through his binoculars. Pearl Harbor lay spread before him like a giant map, its anchorages filled with the gray shapes of the American Pacific Fleet. At 7:49 a.m., Fuchida broke radio silence with the fateful message that would echo through history. Tora! 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 Tiger! 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 The code words indicating that complete tactical surprise had been achieved. Moments later, the first bombs fell on Ford Island in the center of Pearl Harbor, sending geysers of water and debris skyward. Reference: the attack's timeline and radio communications were meticulously documented in the Congressional Pearl Harbor Investigation Committee reports published in 1946 on Battleship Row. The pride of the American Navy lay moored in orderly fashion, their crews enjoying the lazy pace of a Sunday morning. The battleship Arizona, launched in 1915 and mounting 12 14-inch guns, had just completed morning colors when the first Japanese torpedo bombers screamed overhead. Captain Franklin Van Valkenburg, a career naval officer from Wisconsin, was among the first to realize that this was no drill. The torpedo attack developed with devastating precision. Japanese pilots, trained to attack moving warships, found stationary targets almost impossibly easy. The battleship Oklahoma, struck by 5 torpedoes in rapid succession, began listing heavily to port. Within minutes, the 27,000-ton vessel had capsized completely, trapping hundreds of sailors inside her hull. Lieutenant Commander Shigeharu Murata led the torpedo attack with deadly efficiency. Flying his Kate bomber barely 50 feet above the water, he watched his torpedo streak toward the battleship West Virginia. The explosion that followed sent a column of water higher than the ship's mainmast. Behind him, other torpedo bombers pressed home their attacks with similar success. The high-level bombing attack, led by Captain Tadashi Kusumi, targeted the repair facilities and oil storage tanks that were crucial to Pearl Harbor's function as a naval base. From 10,000 feet, the Japanese bombardiers released their modified 16-inch shells with devastating accuracy. The naval ammunition depot erupted in a series of explosions that shattered windows throughout Honolulu. But it was the attack on the Arizona that would sear itself into American memory forever. At 8:06 a.m., a single armor-piercing bomb, dropped from Lieutenant Takeshi Hirata's high-level bomber, penetrated the battleship's forward magazine. The explosion that followed lifted the massive vessel's bow completely out of the water before settling back in a fountain of flame and smoke. In that single moment, over 1,000 American sailors perished. Seaman First Class Donald Stratton was painting the Arizona's mainmast when the world exploded around him. The 20-year-old sailor from Nebraska found himself surrounded by flames as burning oil from the shattered battleship spread across Pearl Harbor's waters like liquid death. The temperature of the inferno reached over 2,000 degrees, hot enough to melt steel and turn human bodies to ash in seconds. Throughout Pearl Harbor, American servicemen responded to the attack with whatever weapons they could find. Seamen. Second Class Doris Miller, an African-American mess attendant aboard the battleship West Virginia, helped carry his mortally wounded captain to safety before manning an anti-aircraft gun, despite having no formal gunnery training. His heroic actions would later earn him the Navy Cross, making him one of the first Black Americans to receive such high military decoration. The second wave of Japanese attackers, 171 aircraft strong, arrived at 8:54 a.m. to find Pearl Harbor transformed into a hellscape of burning ships and billowing smoke. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, leading the second assault, discovered that the element of surprise was gone. American anti-aircraft fire, sporadic during the first attack, had intensified dramatically. At Hickam Field, adjacent to Pearl Harbor, the Japanese assault achieved devastating success against American air power. Rows of Boeing B-17 flying Fortress bombers, America's most advanced strategic weapons, sat wingtip to wingtip on the flight line. Mitsubishi Zero fighters, their machine guns blazing, systematically destroyed these irreplaceable aircraft before they could get airborne. Of the 12 B-17s present, only one survived the attack intact. Wheeler Field, the primary fighter base defending Oahu, suffered similar devastation. Lieutenant Colonel James Rasmussen, the base commander, watched helplessly as Japanese dive bombers systematically destroyed his Curtiss P-40 Warhawks. The American fighters, designed to meet the threat of enemy bombers, were helpless against attackers that struck without warning from multiple directions simultaneously. Reference: eyewitness accounts compiled by historian Walter Lord in his comprehensive study Day of Infamy provided detailed documentation of individual experiences during the attack. At Schofield Barracks, soldiers of the 24th and 25th Infantry Divisions scrambled to defensive positions as Japanese fighters strafed the installation. Private Robert Lee, a young draftee from Georgia, grabbed a Springfield rifle and joined his comrades in futile attempts to shoot down the low-flying attackers. The irony was not lost on observers that America's most modern military installation was being defended with weapons that had seen service in the previous World War. Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, watched the destruction of his command from the windows of his headquarters overlooking the harbor. The 59-year-old career naval officer, who had taken command of the Pacific Fleet just 10 months earlier, understood immediately that his professional life was over. The fleet he had been charged to protect was being systematically destroyed before his eyes. By 9:45 a.m., the second wave of attackers had completed their mission and were heading back toward their carriers. Behind them, Pearl Harbor resembled nothing so much as a maritime graveyard. 4 battleships, Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, and California, were sunk or sinking. 4 more battleships, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers had suffered varying degrees of damage. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed, most of them on the ground. The human cost was even more staggering. 2,403 Americans had been killed, with another 1,178 wounded. The battleship Arizona alone accounted for nearly half the dead, her crew entombed forever in their steel sarcophagus on the harbor bottom. Yet from the Japanese perspective, the attack had been incomplete. The 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had been absent from Pearl Harbor, conducting training exercises or delivering aircraft to other Pacific bases. More critically, Admiral Nagumo had chosen not to launch a third wave of attacks against Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and dry docks. These installations, whose destruction would have crippled American naval operations in the Pacific for years, remained intact and functional. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sat in his study at the White House, his powerful hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair, as Navy Secretary Frank Knox delivered the preliminary casualty reports from Pearl Harbor. The date was December 8, 1941, and the man who had guided America through the Great Depression now faced the greatest crisis in the nation's history since the Civil War. The telephone had not stopped ringing since the first fragmentary reports began arriving the previous evening. Secretary of State Hull, who had been scheduled to receive Japanese Ambassador Nomura and Special Envoy Kurusu at the precise moment the attack began, struggled to contain his fury. The Japanese diplomats, unaware that their nation had launched its surprise attack, had arrived at the State Department to deliver what they believed was Japan's final negotiating position. Hull's response had been unprintably harsh. Across the nation, Americans gathered around their radios in stunned disbelief as news bulletins interrupted regular programming. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered the isolationist sentiment that had dominated American politics since the end of the First World War. Overnight, the great debate between interventionists and isolationists became irrelevant. America had been attacked, and America would respond. Reference: Contemporary polling data compiled by the Gallup organization showed American support for war with Japan jumping from 36% to 97% in the 24 hours following. Pearl Harbor. At 12:30 p.m. on December 8th, President Roosevelt entered the House of Representatives to address a joint session of Congress. His speech, masterfully crafted to capture the nation's sense of outrage while rallying support for total war, would become one of the most famous addresses in American history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The president's speech, lasting barely 6 minutes, galvanized a nation still reeling from the shock of attack. Within 33 minutes of Roosevelt's address, Congress had declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, a pacifist who had also voted against American entry into the First World War. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring radio broadcasts from his flagship in Japanese waters, understood immediately that his carefully calculated gamble had failed catastrophically. The attack on Pearl Harbor, designed to discourage American resistance, had instead unified the American people behind total war. The industrial giant that Japan had hoped to intimidate was now aroused to terrible purpose. The strategic implications became clear within days. Germany and Italy, bound by the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States on December 11th, thereby relieving Roosevelt of the difficult choice between concentrating on Japan or supporting Britain against Hitler. America now faced enemies on two fronts, but it also gained the moral clarity of righteous warfare against fascist aggression. Admiral Chester William Nimitz, selected to replace the disgraced Kimmel as Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, arrived in Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day 1941 to find a transformed naval base. The smoke had cleared, the fires were extinguished, and American ingenuity was already hard at work. The battleship California, sunk at her moorings, was being raised by teams of Navy divers and civilian contractors. The Nevada, beached to prevent her sinking, was undergoing emergency repairs that would return her to service within months. More importantly, the attack had failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's infrastructure. The fuel storage tanks, machine shops, and dry docks that Japan had left untouched were now working around the clock to support America's Pacific War effort. The submarines that would strangle Japan's merchant marine were being serviced and supplied from facilities that should have been destroyed on December 7th. The sleeping giant that Admiral Yamamoto had feared was indeed awakening, and its industrial might was already turning toward vengeance. In Detroit, automobile factories were retooling to produce tanks and aircraft engines. In shipyards from Maine to California, new warships were taking shape at unprecedented speed. The arsenal of democracy was mobilizing for total war. Japan had achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor, but at the cost of strategic disaster. The attack that was meant to discourage American resistance had instead ensured that the war would continue until one nation or the other lay in ruins. As Emperor Hirohito had warned his military leaders, Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The path from Pearl Harbor led inexorably to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Japan's surrender aboard the battleship Missouri, one of the new generation of American warships whose construction was accelerated. By the date which will live in infamy,